Good morning. Thank you for joining us today at the Aspen Cyber Summit. I am not Kylie Atwood, as your programs say. Due to the relatively minor amount of breaking news that is unfolding in Washington this week, Kylie was not able to make it up here today. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Aspen Cyber Program and a contributing editor at Wired, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Lisa Monaco, who was President Obama's Homeland Security advisor and former Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and is now a partner at O'Melveny & Myers and the co-chair of Aspen's Cybersecurity group, along with Congressman Will Hurd and IBM CEO Ginny Rometty, and then John Demers, who is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security in the current administration. So thank you both for joining us today. We're here this morning to talk a little bit about supply chain risks and emerging technologies as the U.S. Sort of competes in a global landscape around a series of emerging technologies, some of which Director Murray just mentioned, 5G notably among them. And sort of particularly what the role of U.S. law enforcement and the Justice Department is in securing both the supply chain, but then also sort of protecting American technology and American innovation. And Lisa, I thought I might start by starting with you with a little bit of a historical perspective on when you stepped into the Obama administration and were leading the National Security Division at the Justice Department. It marked sort of a turning point for the U.S. government's approach on economic espionage and protecting trade secrets. And I wonder if you might sort of talk a little bit about that evolution.
Sure. Thanks, Garrett. It's great to be here. Thanks to Aspen and to the sponsors here for having me and convening this. And it's great to be here with John. He and I have worked together in the past, and he is doing a great job leading the division that we both love. So to your question, Garrett, you know, when I had the job that John now has as the leader of the National Security Division, I was coming in after having served as the chief of staff to a then little-known Washington lawyer named Bob Mueller. And at the time, obviously, the focus in the National Security Division, the National Security team in the administration was on fighting terrorism. And John Carlin, of course, alluded to this in his remarks this morning. And of course, that remained the focus and still is of the wonderful men and women of the National Security Division. But at the time, we also saw the cyber threat rising in importance. And of course, in 2013, it actually surpassed terrorism on the list of worldwide threats that are ranked by our intelligence community. So that was the context. And what I believed very strongly at the time was we needed to apply the lessons that we had learned in fighting the terrorism threat as a government to the cybersecurity threat. So that meant a few things. It meant having a whole of government approach to include using law enforcement tools, to include using financial sanctions, intelligence tools, military, diplomatic, you name it. We had to apply that same all-tools approach against the cyber threat that we had and continue to against the terrorism threat. And in the National Security Division, what that meant was establishing the first ever national security cyber specialist prosecutors nationwide. And that also meant starting the first case that ultimately ended up being the first time that individuals and military members from a nation state were indicted for cyber-enabled economic espionage. Of course, this is the case that ultimately became the 5 members of the PLA. So that was the strategy, right? We needed to apply intelligence tools, understand the threat, and then use every tool in the toolbox to impose costs, to include indictments. And all credit to John and his team, who are, I think, continuing that strategy and frankly accelerating it and doing a terrific job with almost, it seems, announcements on a weekly basis, which I'm sure John will talk about.
Yeah. So speaking of weekly announcements of indictments against China, this fall marks sort of the 1-year anniversary of an initiative that you have been instrumental in helping to lead at the Justice Department, sort of loosely called the China Initiative. And we did see a new case come out this week about a Chinese asset in the U.S. that you indicted. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about that initiative and sort of how you see these cases helping to shape the geopolitical environment.
Great. Well, thanks, Garrett, and thanks to all of you for spending your morning with us, and thanks to Aspen and to Lisa for being here as well. And yeah, Lisa and I worked together when the National Security Division got started in 2006, and my first time through the National Security Division and the department. And it is, I think, a testament to the work that's been done in the National Security Division that we continue to build on each other's work and on one another's work. And very much, you know, the indictments that we've done, particularly in the economic espionage realm, in the cyber realm, very much build on that seminal 2014 indictment that Lisa and John Carlin managed to get done. And I always talk of that as the beginning of a new moment in our strategy, really, beginning of a strategy. And the one thing to remember about that is these indictments are not just law enforcement actions, they are law enforcement actions, but they have foreign policy implications. And so it's a big deal to indict intelligence officers of a country or military officers of a country. But we're very much building on that strategy. And we had a case, you know, earlier this week, which was more on the political espionage side of a fellow out in San Francisco who's alleged to have acted as a courier, and he was doing dead drops. I mean, really, if you read the complaint, it's a great kind of spy novel story of the way the Chinese intelligence officers get information from the United States back into China. But it highlights, I think, more broadly the types of tactics they use. One, both on the sort of the economic espionage side, which is maybe a little bit more related to the supply chain side, and on the political espionage side, you have it directed by and large these days by the Chinese intelligence services. So what that means is that they're going to use the same tradecraft that they've honed over the centuries for political espionage, for state-to-state espionage, and they're going to apply it on the economic side. And one of the things, you know, a few things from this week's indictment, I mean, one of them is Chinese intelligence officers don't like to come to the United States because they're really vulnerable here, right? So they'd rather stay in China. Well, then how do you do that? Well, then if you're going to stay in China, you have to use the internet to access people. So we had a spy case where, you know, the first reach out is very often through social media, right? And then it leads to phone calls, and then it leads to a visit to China, right? But none of that is the Chinese officer coming here. We had our first Chinese intelligence officer who we extradited from Belgium, right? That's another tactic. You know, a lot of folks don't want to go to China. They feel a little vulnerable in China. Great, let's meet in the seemingly, you know, neutral third country. And Europe or other places are places like that. So you see a lot of these tactics, but the goal is to get information. And frankly, from the intelligence services perspective, whether it's political information or economic information, it doesn't matter to them. They're being told to get it.
Mm-hmm. You just touched on this, but just to put a sharper point on this. So are you, during the era that Lisa is talking about, it seemed like much of the energy was coming out of the PLA in terms of economic espionage cases. And now that sort of seems like that has transitioned behind the scenes to being primarily the Ministry of State Security that is the primary driver of economic espionage coming from China. Is that what you were seeing?
There's been a shift, I think, over time. And with that shift to the intelligence services is a shift in tradecraft. So the military officers were involved in the sort of pure cyber intrusion case that Lisa was talking about. Once you get the intelligence services involved, they'll use cyber, but they'll also do the sort of the human case, right? Because they're used to doing that. They're used to co-opting people to get what they need. And then we've had hybrid cases too, where they co-opt someone to implant malware on a computer system at a company, and then, you know, do the intrusion remotely once the system has been compromised.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, this sort of brings us to some of the work that you've been doing over the last year under the auspices of the Aspen Cyber Group. talking about the innovation challenge that the U.S. actually faces. And I wonder if you could sort of summarize that.
Sure. And in fact, I'll also take the opportunity to do a little advertisement. Today, the Aspen Cybersecurity Group released a report. You can find it on the Aspen Institute website, really describing the innovation challenge in the moment we face today, which we call out in the report is frankly unprecedented. The challenge that we face, unprecedented since after World War II and after the Sputnik moment that really launched us, no pun intended, to a renewed moment and a renewed emphasis on research and development and technological innovation that kept the U.S. as the leader of the world in that space for quite a long time. But that's changed. And we describe in the report the fact that we do face an innovation challenge, and what are the things that we need to do as a country to get that back? Because we believe this is a bipartisan group of leaders from academia, industry, former government officials. We've all come together to describe this challenge and say we need to have basically a new moonshot, innovation moonshot effort. We need to have a kind of new emphasis and a sense of urgency, and frankly, a research and development agenda led by the United States and led by federal funding in foundational research, right? So today, we spend as a percentage of GDP just over 20% in terms of federal funding for just general foundational research. Back post-World War II, in the effort that led us to the moon, that was up to 60%, right? So we're going in the wrong direction, and we really need federal funding for general research, because that's what fuels innovation. And that US-led innovation, US values in that innovation for things like AI and quantum computing, that's what's going to change the dynamic and not put us in the type of situation where we are today, where we talk about Huawei and 5G and the fact that our allies and partners don't have good alternatives in trusted vendors. And we really need to change that dynamic.
John, Lisa just mentioned Huawei, which has been a theme of a number of different cases that your division has brought over the last year. And we've seen this sort of series of questions also pop up last year with ZTE. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about the way that the department has approached Huawei over the last year.
So I think from a Justice Department perspective, our cases deal with other Huawei problems than the one that's here. So I'll talk about them and then come back to this issue. I mean, for our cases, you know, well, of course, Lisa talked about kind of American values. So, you know, one of our cases are about Iran sanctions violations against Huawei, and then allegedly lying to the financial community in order to continue to be able to do business with them despite the sanctions violations. And then we have something that we've seen across the board from China, which is intellectual property theft, right? So that's a second case that's going on right now involving Huawei. And as I said, that's sort of emblematic of many of our cases that involve intellectual property theft on behalf either of the Chinese government or Chinese companies. With respect to Huawei in the supply chain context that Lisa was talking about, it's the concern there is more about access and integrity to telecommunications network, and whether the use of Huawei equipment, you know, increases Chinese government access and could then lead to, in the future, the Chinese government using the telecommunications network to deny telecommunications services if they ever needed to in a sort of worst case scenario of conflict. And so we have been doing a lot of work with our foreign partners on this issue. And Lisa's right. I mean, one of the challenges here is when you begin now, it's, you know, people say, well, what are the alternatives, right? And sometimes there are alternatives, but they're much more expensive. And so you have the question of, well, what's, you know, is it really worth it for me if I'm the other person to spend that extra money to get the security for a problem that may manifest itself? I don't know, you know. So they're thinking through all those issues. So here in the States, the way we've tried to approach it, this supply chain issue generally, is through the CFIUS process, which Congress then expanded as is the Committee on foreign investment in the US and reviewing foreign investment for purchases of parts of the supply chain, if you will. The second is through the Team Telecom process, which is a similar interagency process that looks at FCC licensing of telecommunications operators in the US, and the FCC did deny a Chinese telecommunications license earlier this year, which was the first time that they had done that based on national security concerns. And then, the other way that we've been doing it, or I guess we will begin to do it now, is through this new supply chain executive order, which is meant to give the government the authority beyond itself. Congress has done this for the federal government, right? They said you can't use money to put Huawei on your equipment or other untrusted providers on your government equipment. But the question is, what do you do for states and localities, for instance, who come to you and they say, look, the question is, do I get broadband or do I not get broadband, right? And these people are offering to put it in. Now, there's risks to that. I mean, you map out where the broadband is in the United States provided by Huawei. Without going into detail, it doesn't look, charitable or unintentional in its distribution. But to the same token, as Lisa was saying, then, what then is the federal government's role to allow these localities to spend more money to get, the internet that they need to have their citizens live the kind of lives that the rest of us lead in cities like this?
And I'm sort of curious from your perspective, understanding that you're looking at this from the Justice Department's seat on the CFIUS process. How have you seen the Trump administration change the way that they are thinking about the CFIUS process? Because this is something that was a relatively obscure government body,
right.
5-10 years ago, and yet has become very much at the fore of this debate in the last year and a half or 2 years.
Yeah. So I think now I'm not allowed to talk about any particular transactions in the CFIUS context, and although some have been publicly mentioned as having been blocked, and they've involved, these telecommunications, semiconductors, et cetera. So I think, it's interesting. My guess is, I haven't talked to Lisa about this, my guess is our position hasn't changed. The DOJ position has always been like, we need to do this, we need to do that. But what has changed is the dynamic in the interagency, right? And you traditionally had a split between sort of the national security agencies and the commercial agencies, and they would push maybe in different directions. And now I think there's more consensus that we need to be focused on these national security vulnerabilities. And so, yes, you're seeing, I think, a different outcome at the end of the process. Both the blocks get the visibility, but they're really few and far between. A lot of what happens is mitigation agreements, most of which are non-public, about where the data is going to be, who's going to have access to what, and then also some transactions get withdrawn because they'd rather withdraw them.
I'd just add on to that now from my seat, kind of outside of government and advising companies, I think what you see is also an uptick in CFIUS review of acquisitions that are not the bricks and mortar acquisitions of the past. It used to be that I think the docket for the CFIUS docket was really populated by acquisitions, foreign acquisitions of bricks and mortar facilities. Now, as is reflected in our globally connected economy, it's about review of acquisitions that could include acquisition of data sets or the ability to access large data sets. And so that has really, I think, changed what it means to be a company now considering how to navigate that process.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of companies that are getting pulled in that I think are surprised by it.
Yep.
And one of the things that we are beginning to see sort of as this discussion about emerging technologies and their deployment is unfurling around the country, around the world, is a split in many ways between countries that are choosing to invest Huawei as sort of the foundational layer of their 5G technologies, and countries like the West, or countries like the US, that are trying to, as best they can, to resist. But the US, largely through Mike Pompeo and the State Department this year, has had a rather aggressive strategy of trying to push foreign allies to block Huawei out of their systems. But that doesn't seem like it's actually taking hold everywhere that we would hope that it holds. And you have countries now, like Italy, saying that they will allow Huawei in. Britain, of course, has managed this risk through a joint partnership between Huawei and GCHQ, where they sort of bring in their technologies and sort of tear them down and look at them and point out security risks. John, do you see that as a possible model for sort of how the U.S. moves forward with 5G in the U.S.? I mean, do we need a joint NSA, Huawei
so we can make Huawei
center?
better at what they do using our NSA capabilities? No,
It's a new kind
no.
of partnership.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think the question is, there is this sort of risk mitigation model in the UK, and the question is always, why do you want to take on a risk that you're going to spend so much time and energy trying to manage? And if you have another choice, and that comes back to Lisa's point, but are you going to have the Russians build your election equipment and then say, oh, I'm really going to monitor the heck out of these election systems and make sure that nothing happens? Why? Don't even buy those, right? Now there you have a choice, so it's a little easier, right? So I don't think that's the right approach to this problem. The difficulty of this problem is this: the choice of whether to use Huawei or not is a geopolitical choice. It's not just an intelligence choice, and so a country that's making that choice has a lot of considerations in mind as it makes that choice, right? And including foreign direct investment from China, and including access to Chinese markets, right? And so it's a very difficult choice for many countries around the world to make, depending on their economic circumstances, right? And the second difficult thing with this issue is, once the equipment is in your system, and then you figure out something went wrong, it's kind of too late. It's like saying, I'm going to keep smoking until I find out I have cancer. Well, that's kind of too late, right? If you end up, many smokers never have cancer. So maybe, you'd say, well, I'm going to just take that risk. But it's too late. And that's the problem with this equipment. And one of the issues, that the UK has been going through is they think about it is, what's the cost of taking the existing equipment out? It really gets prohibitive. Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of generational decision right now about what equipment you're going to put in. And, if something does happen and then you realize you made a mistake and you've got to go fix it, it's going to be really expensive down the road.
The other thing I would say on that is, and John's absolutely right to point out there are the choices you make at the front end that are then going to have consequences, but there's also, it's just the tip of the iceberg of the challenge, right? So we're concerned about Huawei now building the infrastructure that 5G is going to rest on, which is going to power at 100 times what the Internet of Things devices that are now getting connected and creating smart cities. Well, do we want this infrastructure to be kind of owned and operated and controlled by a company from a country that does not observe the rule of law, right? So we've got kind of these bigger considerations, and this issue is being compounded again by the explosion of Internet of Things devices, which is, you mentioned the work we do in the Aspen Cybersecurity Group. This is one of the reasons we also issued a set of principles, again, this bipartisan group coming together to issue a set of first principles for what manufacturers, consumers, and others should be thinking about when it comes to Internet of Things devices, right? So we've got to, I think, tackle this problem at every level.
Mm-hmm. John, how engaged is the National Security Division at the front end working with companies that are sort of looking to expand supply chains in China? Sort of how much sort of front end mitigation conversations are you involved in?
Not too much. I mean, if they come to us, but they'd also might go to the FBI instead. So not too much on the front end side. We do a lot of outreach to companies, and I spend a lot of my time on the road, and to try to convince them to work with us. But that's particularly, to work with us on any, suspected intrusion that they find, or any other, an employee who has been trying to gain access to something, and they come to us and work with us so we can help inform their trying to fix the problem, and then also they can inform our investigation of the problem. We can put it in a broader context. If there is a broader context, maybe it's just a rogue employee, but it's usually not. And so we do a lot of work with that. And as we do that, we talk to them about, and they often have many questions about prevention and what can I do about, security measures or investments in China. We definitely never say don't invest in China. I mean, that would be a foolish thing to say, but you just have to be smart about what you put there and what you don't put there and where the data rests and all that.
I think this initiative that John mentioned, it was started under John Carlin's leadership of having companies have a point of contact and be able to reach out to the specialists and the lawyers in John's division is really, really important because, again, now being on outside of government and working with companies in the private sector, you do not want to be having that first conversation in the crisis. You want to have established that relationship at the front end.
And you want to have thought through some of these issues.
Exactly.
We always say, and I'm sure you said the same thing, Lisa, and John said it before, just go to the board, have these discussions,
Exactly.
Go to your executive committee, have these discussions. What are you going to do in the same way that you have, you game out other crises? What are you going to do? When are you going to go to the government? Because if you start having, even you've never had are we going to report this to the government conversation? It's going to take you weeks for everyone, the CFO to weigh in, and the GC, and the security person, and the CEO, and the board. So have all that ahead of time.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
And we will take a 10-minute break and give everyone a chance to grab some breakfast and have some coffee, and then come right back for more conversations today.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.